Separate property and community property, it's a confusing topic. In fact, when I was in law school, there was an entire class, a full semester class, devoted just to this topic. So I want to address real quickly, why is this important in estate planning? And before I sat down to record this video this morning, I did a quick Google search, just typed in separate property, community property, Texas law. I found a bunch of articles, a bunch of blog posts, a few videos recorded by attorneys primarily focusing on why is it important in a family law scenario. So if you were getting divorced, obviously we don't handle divorce action, so I want to focus on why is it important in estate planning. Now here's a quick summary of separate property and community property. If you haven't done any of the research, this is a quick summary of how those things are distinct. So Texas law defines separate property as things that you owned prior to the marriage. Number two, things that you acquired during the marriage by gift or inheritance. So in other words, if you're married and somebody gives you something, that gift to you is separate property. Number three, recovery from personal injury claims. And number four, things that you purchased while married with money that was considered to be separate property. So that's not an exhaustive list, but that's going to cover the major points of it. And then community property is all property other than separate property that was acquired by either spouse during the marriage. So Texas law also has what we call the community property presumption. We're going to presume that it's community property unless you can prove by clear and convincing evidence that it is your separate property. Now, here's a quick note. If you are an unmarried individual, you only have separate property. Separate property and community property is only important if you're married. So if you're a married couple, you have community property. You may have separate property. But if you're an unmarried person, it's just your stuff. There's no separate or community. It's just all yours. So why is this important in estate planning? Well, primarily it's important because your will or your portion of the living trust can control your separate property. Your spouse's will or your spouse's portion of the living trust cannot control your separate property. In other words, they can't decide that your separate property is going to be given to a certain person. That's your decision. Another distinction or another important factor about separate property is that generally your separate property is not subject to claims or creditors of your spouse. And also, your separate property will only get a basis adjustment. This is more tax planning, but it will only get a basis adjustment, or what we often call a step-up in basis, at the time you pass away. Compared to community property, that property will get a tax basis adjustment upon the death of the first spouse and again on the second spouse. So I hope that helps give you a kind of a concise understanding of what is separate property, community property, and why it's important in estate planning.